Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be talking about the APU, which of course is featured in the PlayStation 4 and likely to be in the Xbox 720 Durango. We're going to be discussing exactly what is an APU, what are the benefits of it, what are the downsides to an APU, and exactly how it works. I realise that some of this technology is probably going to not really make sense to some of you, and that's why I will be recording another video very soon, which is going to be going into memory bandwidth, another one which is going to be going into videos on graphics card systems and how they work, as well as CPU architecture as well. And you know what I'm trying to do is boil everything down as basically as possible so you guys, by the time it's finished, understand it at least to a degree. So anyway, we're going to move on to APUs to begin with, and APUs stand for Accelerated Processing Units. I'll say that one more time, Accelerated Processing Units. And of course the variation that is in the PlayStation 4 is of course from AMD. And the AMD version inside is an amalgamation of the Jaguar core, which by itself is an upgraded version of course, the Bobcat CPU, as well as a variation of the Southern Islands GPU from AMD, of course, which is based on the 7000 series, of course, which is one of the later ones, and that in itself has GCN cores, which are extremely programmable. Okay, so you now understand what it is, but what exactly does it do and how does it benefit? Well, it's pretty much the two chips are placed on the same processor die. Now, if you were to open up your PC and you were to look inside, you'd most likely notice that there's a fan in the middle, which of course is the heatsink fan for your CPU, and there's also likely to be a graphics card unless it's integrated onto the system. Now, there are benefits of a more standard approach, if you will, and that is, well, it's very upgradable, which is fantastic for PCs, although we are moving in towards a more integrated solutions. I'll go into that more in a moment. But for smaller devices, a.la. consoles, or for example notebooks, netbooks, cell phones and so on, it's not really the best option available. And therefore now we're starting to go into more the system on chip approach. Now in this case you have the CPU, which in this case is the Jaguar, and the GPU, which in this case of course would be the Radeon GCN cores, 18 of them, just so you know. And they're basically smushed together on the same die. Yes, smushed is the technical term. And this gives several benefits. Now, first of all, most of the controller stuff, so that would be stuff normally reserved for the North Bridge. So, for example, memory controller and so on is actually placed on the chip itself. There are a few others, including, for example, video decoders, display inputs, and most of the bus interfaces. But to be honest with you, the real plus, if you will, is lower power requirements, the improved performance, at least in a very enclosed environment, as well as lower heat output. And more to the point, well, let's just go into the processing side of things. Now, in terms of processing, as I've said, there's CPU and there's GPU. Now, GPUs are fantastic for certain calculations, as CPUs, or regular central processing units, are better at others. As it turns out, the CPU is a much more general type of processor. And in the case of the PlayStation 4, it is a hybrid. Now, bear in mind that AMD Jaguar has been significantly, or at least somewhat, changed for the PlayStation 4. We don't know all of the ins and outs yet. We do know it runs at 1.6 GHz. We're pretty darn certain of that. We're also pretty darn certain of a few other bits and bobs, including the amount of cache and so on the cores have, but we don't really know all of the specific instructions that Sony have asked or have included on the processor. Now, we know, for example, that Sony and AMD have worked together and tied in, and AMD themselves have said that this is the most complicated APU that they've actually done. They've actually been quite happy about that, quite bullish in their boasts, shall we say. So, as I was saying, CPUs are very general. They're very scalar in design, and GPUs are much better in vector processing. Now, bear in mind that CPUs and GPUs are no stranger to being integrated. For quite a while now, we've actually had IGPs, and they've done okay. I mean, they can run basic games, but honestly, if you're trying to play a game like, say, Call of Duty Black Ops 2 or, you know, Elder Scrolls or Grand Theft Auto or what have you on them, you're going to get massive lag and you're just going to get crappy performance. And there are a couple of reasons for this we'll go into now. One of them is memory bandwidth. Now, a lot of the time they have very, very inefficient memory access, particularly from the GPU to the RAM itself. And this, of course, leads to massive latency. Another issue they have is just they don't simply have enough power. In other words, it doesn't matter how much RAM and how fast the RAM is. If it just can't be processed quick enough, it doesn't matter, really. So in other words, they're just underpowered all the way around possible. Now, in the better IGPs, it's improvement. They've I'll start again. They've got much better access to hardware. The problem is they've still got massive latency, and quite simply put, it still has to go through the PCIe bus. It still has to rely on Northbridge, and so on. And that basically means you've still got quite a lot of delay, and therefore the two can't really talk together and be almost like one. Now, on something like a games console, you can't have that. Now, as you know, the PlayStation 3, or sorry, PlayStation 4 doesn't really have memory bandwidth limitations. The Xbox 720, that could be a bit of a sticking point. Remember, though, it does have less GPU power to work with. I think it's got around 12 GCN cores, although, of course, that number is up in the air. We don't know 100%, compared, of course, to the rather insane 18 of the PS4. Now, obviously, that's still not a huge amount if you compare it to, say, the, 32 of some of the graphics cards out today. But it's still pretty darn impressive. And memory bandwidth is massively important. Now, to understand exactly what GCN, or shall I say, what the importance of the APU is, let's just quickly go over the description of what actually an APU does. Now, as I said before, the PS4 variant of this core is an x64/x86 variant, which of course makes it extremely compatible with most PC stuff now. Now, the CPU on paper isn't anything to be massively excited about. In other words, if you look at the specifications of the CPU, and I have been doing some calculations on this, and I'm willing to release them later on, I haven't finished yet, but you may remember another video that I put out quite recently going over NVIDIA's findings on the PS4. Now, obviously, NVIDIA have a vested interest. Obviously, they were somewhat trying to compete against AMD. Now, we don't really know how successful or how much they were trying to compete against AMD in terms of Sony's business. We just don't know. Right now, NVIDIA are extremely let's say, concentrating on the mobile market. But still, I imagine it would have been quite a nice kudos for them to have gotten into it. But AMD, quite simply put, have a much better integrated offering. Now, GPUs, as I've said before, are extremely good at making certain calculations, so we'll go into exactly how they work really well in a second. Now, I'm not going to go completely into depth here, because if I was to go into complete depth of each CPU and GPU, I could easily make each part 30 minutes long, so this will be a separate video, but I'm going to give you a quick, brief overview. But I will, as I said, release another set of videos probably within the next couple of days, but I have a lot to do. Anyway, there are certain benefits of GPU and certain benefits of CPU. Now, GPUs are very good with vector-based applications, and we'll go into exactly what they are in a moment. But CPUs are very good on their own merits too. CPUs are far more general. They have, generally speaking, access to a lot more instructions. For example, SSE, and for programming for various applications, it's a lot easier. For example, small data arrays have overhead associated with setting up vector processing, and so it can easily overwhelm and outweigh the time saved from the faster calculations of the GPU. Now, scalar CPUs in other words, the regular CPU that you've probably got, well, you have got on your PC, let alone probably you will have on your PC. So that could be Intel, it can be AMD, it doesn't matter. Scalar basically operates on a very simple principle. They operate on one data point at a time, while vector processors operate on arrays of data. The other benefit of Scalar is vector processing often requires prolonged startup time of the computer because it has a lot more tasks to be performed. Therefore, it's very good at very simple, easy tasks. On the other hand, a GPU isn't. A GPU, or graphics processing unit, now is getting to the point where it's a monster. If you were to look at it, it has many SIMDs. Now, these SIMDs stand for, quite simply, single instruction multi-data, which is basically a parallel version of computing. Now, often these SIMDs, or also known as shaders, there's not just one or two or three of these suckers, or say 8. There's often hundreds or if not thousands of these shaders on a dedicated GPU device. Now, in, say, the case of the 7970, which of course is based on the Southern Island systems, which of course the PlayStation 4 is built upon, although admittedly with less shaders, of course. For example, it has a 2048. Now, this is based on 32 compute units, which, to say the least, is pretty darn impressive. Now, I'm going to give you the very basic idea of what the stream processors do. Now, when the GPU, or should I say the stream processors, are given a set of data, or known as stream if you prefer, a series of operations, or kernel functions, is applied to the elements in the stream. Now, often, local on-chip memory or cache is used for this, since a lot of these application, or should I say functions, are similar to each of the streams themselves. So in other words, the data is constantly reused. So how does that work, and how does that interfere, and how does that interface with APUs? Because obviously we've talked a little bit about what CPUs are good at, what GPUs are good at, but that doesn't really tell you what APUs are. Is it just a simple case of APUs cut down the cost? Yes, it does. For example, as I've said previously, most of the stuff is on the same chip. Now, if that was the end of it, that would be cool, but it's not. Several minutes ago in this video, you may remember how I said that the PlayStation 4 CPU is not anything spectacular, it's not amazing, it's not bad, but it favors heavy multi-core. Now, there are several things that GPUs, or should I say stream processing, really does well, and as I said before, compute calculations are one of them. I'll give you a very simple example for those of you who aren't that familiar with, say, creative applications. Adobe Photoshop, but more to the point, video applications like Adobe After Effects or, say, Premiere, work a hell of a lot better if you accelerate their functionality with GPU. That often means that they're able to render and display the videos on the fly compared to the CPU needing to really number crunch and do everything on itself. You can also notice this on a lot of 3D applications as well. Quite simply put, that applications like, say, NVIDIA's Quadro and so on, it really helps to accelerate the calculations done. Now, obviously, that in itself is nice, but now we're getting a lot more integration. The APU and the CPU, or should I say the GPU and the CPU, are now integrated onto one very, very small die, well, at least comparatively. Now, back in the day when this type of thing used to happen, there was pretty much a need for a chip-to-chip crossing between the memory controller and either the CPU or GPU, depending what you need to access data at the time. That means that you get memory latency and consumes more power and so on, which is obviously bad. Now, APUs don't do this. APUs, the CPU and the GPU section, share a common pathway to system RAM. So, quite simply put, it doesn't need to wait so long. The data is just easier to access. So, what other benefits does it have other than just quicker memory access? Is it just a case that we're going to get less latency? No. It also means that if the CPU is, say, struggling on a particular application that the SIMDs or GPU cores, or however you want to, say it, are good at, the architects are able to really utilize this. Now, this is very similar to what happened back in the day of the PlayStation 3. Remember, the PS3 could also do very similar things, although the Cell was actually really good at helping the very weak, maybe not very weak, that's a bit harsh, but the pretty weak GPU of the PS3. In that case, the Cell CPUs could lend themselves and say, hey, we're around, buddy. We can give you a handshake, and they can help prop up the effects. Now, remember as well, this is very similar to what happened on Alan Wake, for example, on the Xbox 360 as well. The CPU was actually doing quite a lot of the rendering effects in terms of lighting and so on. Now we're getting a little bit different. Now, with the APU, I know what you're going to say, but what about, how does that really affect things? Does that mean, well, it basically means that now we're getting into an era where there's a lot more choice, a lot more power easily accessible. Now, PCs, of course, have been using a very similar approach for gaming for a while. Back in the day of, say, the early Voodoo 2 era, or even the Voodoo 1, should I say, it wasn't like this. It wasn't until later on that we even started to get hardware TNL, or triangle lighting, which took some of the burden off the CPU and started to put it towards the graphics card, and this is becoming more and more the case. But there are still quite a lot of applications and calculations that are just not really good for GPU. In other words, they just don't really work. And the CPU is still the best option to tell the GPU, I need your help with this, I need you to calculate this, and the GPU does as it's told, and does so very quickly. But the thing is, now they're becoming becoming good buddies, I believe is the best way to put it. So obviously now you could start to dedicate cores towards the various functions of both. So for example, let's say the CPU is having issues with, let's go with a very, very old classic, physics. Now, as I've said before, physics usually batters a CPU to pieces, and although I wish it was in more games, hardware physics from NVIDIA is a very good example of this. Hardware physics, if enabled, has a lot more objects, although certain games, like for example Metro 2033, don't really push it as hard as they could. Batman, however, Alice in Wonderland, the new one, I can't remember the name of it, but the new Alice game really does. I think Madness Returns is the name of it, don't quote me on that. They really help to sell the hardware physics, and basically a certain portion of the GPU functions are then relegated to physics. It's that simple. So, for example, if dust flies up, your GPU is processing that. That's one of the reasons that if your game isn't, say, CPU bound, but your game is, say, GPU bound, if you want an example of this, load up one of the if you do happen to have a NVIDIA card, load up this game, put tons of AA on it, so you're getting, let's go with 40 frames a second. In other words, well, the game's playable, but it's struggling a little bit. And then enable hardware physics on one of those games, or disable it depending on which way you want to go, and look at the difference in frame rate. It goes all the way up, right? So obviously, depending on how much work the graphics card's doing at the time with physics. So now it's getting to the point, of course, where the GCN cores can be mapped however they want. They can help out their buddy. They can pretty much, for example, one of the cores could be working on, say, AI. Another core could, say, then tell the GPU, hey, I need your help with the physics here. Or the GPU could do the same thing and ask for help on the other one. In other words, it's dividing the application up as necessary. The SIMD engine is tied in on chip, of course, with a very fast memory controller, and of course the actual bus itself on the GPU, or should I say APU, as well as the cores. And that's of course the PlayStation 4's case, you've got 8 of them, and also you've got the platform interfaces as well. And all of this routes to the system memory. Now, all of this, quite simply put, means that you've got a lot more power. You've literally got a small, tiny PC on a chip, hence the term system on chip. This means that you've got a lot less memory bandwidth limitation issues. It means that you've got a lot more memory to just do as necessary. You don't have to waste bandwidth. So what about for those of us who don't have a a PlayStation 4 dream. In other words, we're not looking to buy the PS4. They're about PC owners. How do we fit into this? Well, that's where it starts to get a bit tricky. You guys know a little bit about Crossfire, maybe, or SLI. For those of you who don't know, I'll very briefly explain. SLI, Scanline Interleaf, or Scan, or whatever you want to call it. Some people call it Interleave, other people call it Interface. Of course, it's by NVIDIA, and Crossfire, of course, is by AMD/ATI. How it's looking right now is that the GPU functionality for your PC is going to remain. In other words, you're still going to have to buy a discrete GPU. So, for example, let's say you in, I don't know, 2 years' time, or at your local, store, or you buy online, what have you. You'll probably notice that AMD are still pushing their Fusion line, or whatever it ends up being called at that point, and you'll notice that the GPUs there are, pretty darn powerful, as you'd expect, but they tie in with the CPU and GPU functionality with the APU that you're probably going to buy. This is pretty much to help the games and every other industry you can imagine grow. Ultimately, of course, CPUs are limited in what they can do by themselves. We're really looking now at architecture which is improving, which is increasing in performance. We're looking at better integration. Now, there are certain things I don't like about the industry right now. I've been quite vocal in the past in that I don't like, for example, Intel's direction with its chip sets, or should I more say with the sockets. I really don't like how Haswell seems to be the last of the interchangeable CPUs, and Broadwell, which is its successor, that's a shrink of Haswell, and that's due out around a year later. So, assuming we see Haswell now, likely in 2014/early 2015, depending obviously if there's delays, we'll see it going MCP, or multi-chip package. Now, a multi-chip package is basically to say that the CPU is going to be soldered onto the motherboard. And Intel would argue that there are benefits to this, including less power usage. And I agree with that, but I don't like the direction it's going. I think personally that's a very bad thing. As a power user, I want to say, hey, you know what? If I decide in 6 months after I've bought a motherboard, you know what, this motherboard sucks balls. Actually, I want a different motherboard. Or, you know what, this CPU's okay, but I've got much bigger requirements now. Or, you know what, I want to do this. You can't do anything. You have to replace the entire sodding thing. I don't like that. Well, this is a completely different rant. I'm going to make a video of this probably as well, bitching about it until, I feel, I've had my daily therapy. But in terms of this, I was actually really, I wasn't really sold on the whole APU side of things, but now I'm reading quite a bit about it, and honestly, guys, I've been reading quite a lot. I don't know if you guys know this. I've mentioned it a couple of times on Facebook, but when I'm actually doing these videos, before I actually do them, I usually have around 20 tabs open on my cell phone. So when I'm going around, I can read about it. I usually do similar on lunch breaks and so on at work. So I like to read quite a bit, and I've been reading a lot about the APUs, and I really like the idea behind them. I would like it even more if we are continue to offer a very excellent discrete graphics option, and I don't really think AMD are going to stop that. It doesn't benefit them, it doesn't benefit us as consumers to do that. After all, right now the PC market is thriving. It's actually doing pretty darn well, and obviously we're probably going to lose a bit of ground, possibly with the PlayStation 4's release, but who knows. As I was saying though, in terms of the PS4, we know that, well, the chip is going to be very powerful, and the fact that it is an APU lends itself very well to the fact that the console is going to be very scalable. very programmable. And obviously the PS3 had quite a lot of limitations. One of them being, quite simply put, memory bandwidth and lack of memory. Now, admittedly, on the PS4, we have 8 gigabytes of GDDR5. Some people are already bitching and saying that 8 gigs isn't enough and blah blah blah, but to be honest with you, for the foreseeable future, 8 gigabytes will be fine. It has 176 gigabytes, I believe, of memory bandwidth, and so that'll be easily enough when tied onto the APU and, or should I say, APU generally, the CPU, and of course the GPU will share that bandwidth very lovingly, as if they are best buddies, and they will skip down the street together. One of the issues, of course, with APUs, although it's not so much of a problem with the PS4, is cooling them. Now, high power devices, and by high power I don't mean in terms of the voltages they require, I mean as in the amount of performance they deliver. Generally speaking, you're looking at a race of silicon, and by which I mean you're literally spending silicon every time you add instructions onto the chip. You're literally increasing the complexity of the chip, and there's only a certain amount you can do. Hence why one of the reasons they've cut down some of the architecture. For example, one of the reasons that they're likely going to be going to a 1.6 gigahertz CPU's clock speed, and one of the reasons, for example, they've only got 18 GCN cores rather than, say, the full mobile version of the 7970, which is, of course, 20 GCN cores, or the 32, of course, of the full compute units that you would see on the desktop variant. But what we are quite happy about right now is the performance increase that we're going to be seeing. Now, if you're a fan of this technology, there's good news indeed, because the PS4 chips, at least variants of them, are actually going to be released to the public, or should I say at the very least to PC developers, so for example Dell or whomever. Now, there are going to be some cutbacks. For example, the chips themselves won't have the Sony instructions on them, whatever Sony have done. So whether it's the x64 instructions that have been specific for Sony, or whether it's the, the built-in chipset function to make you a coffee in the morning, that won't be there. And it looks like as well from the early plans that you're going to be only seeing 4 core variants rather than the bastardized. And I use that in a very nice way. I don't mean that they've done a hash job of it or anything like that, but the 8 core variant of the Jaguar. So anyway, I think that's answered most of the questions you're likely to have. I know some of this stuff is still gone quite in depth, and I didn't mean it to go quite so over the board, but I am going to be releasing individual videos which is going to explain a lot of the stuff, and hopefully you guys are going to love it and appreciate it and enjoy it and consume it, as I really love producing this stuff as well. Anyway, I am pretty tired. I've come in from a work day and I need to edit all the things. And, as I said before, there's going to be a really good giveaway on the 1 million subs. I just want to quickly throw this out there. I'm also going to be doing a lot more videos, as you guys know. I'm going to start live blogs again at some point. I've been really behind. I've only done one blog, which is awful. Website stuff is going to be very heavy. There's going to be an article of this. I don't know if it's going to be today or tomorrow, which is going to go over some of the ground that I haven't really managed to get into in this video. And also, if you're into fighting games, one of my friends in real life or on the channel known as Murasaki is going to be putting out a hell of a lot of content for you guys for Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, and some other stuff as well. He has started the very basic of Darkstalkers, and he's got it on he's got it available for me, but I've been very naughty and I haven't had time to edit it yet, unfortunately. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the stuff, and I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.